Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath. Bow wow. Welcoming you back to another Archon's Armory. Today, as requested, we are talking about T'au weaponry. And as we did an adversaries video already, let's get right into it. We have a lot to correct and a lot to talk about. But starting off with the mythos. So, this is just going to be talking about the T'au as a faction and a lot of their weaponry. There are some things that will not be included within this video, but a majority of the time we'll be focusing on the T'au themselves, with some mention of their allies in general. So, the first myth is that T'au weapons are pure technological advances, that they are technology that is essentially from outside the setting brought in, or that they are a completely different conceptual idea from any other faction and thus are not held by the same standard. This is something that I want to hold up within the T'au. I consider things within universe to be within universe, aka weapons that say they function like X will always function like X, aka when I have a bullet that one faction uses and a bullet that another faction uses, I'm going to assume that they use similar or the same technology. While some may be more advanced, may be better versions, different designs, subtypes, or as I like to call them, side grades to the weapons, I will not put them on this entirely different, as if it were taken from another setting concept. So, not a pure technological advance, merely an advanced version of a different type of weapon. Specifically, we'll talk about with pulse weapons. T'au technology makes up for X or Y within their physiology. The idea that the T'au weapons are created in such a way or modified in such a way because of the Mod Ka or because of their way of war. Now, this is only partially true. A lot of weapons within the T'au arsenal are actually limited to a degree by technology. They are limited by the types of weapons that they prefer to use and the mediums that they prefer to use. So while they might be technically better off with certain weapons, they have essentially grown up their own homegrown indigenous designs in such a way that the T'au prefer them because they can utilize them way better than they technically should be able to. So because their design is built around that, because their technology is based around this concept of being like an alt or side grade to most Imperial technology, or even like Chaos technology or other Xenos, I say that T'au weapons do not make up for anything within their battle tactics or even their physiology. Finally, our next two. T'au have weapons designed for use against any force. Again, this is a thing that comes up with a lot of different factions. They say that the base weapon works against everybody, or that it is deadly against every faction, no matter what, no matter their armor, no matter their protection, whatever tactics they use. T'au weapons will just work against all of them because they're so much more advanced, so much more technological. Again, we can just throw this out. There are weapons that work against lots of different targets in the T'au arsenal, but there are also plenty of things that they fail against, and there are also ones that they are significantly worse than. And we're going to talk about those. But really, the idea that anything is going to be objectively superior or infinitely superior, I'm just going to throw that idea out right now. Not everything is great against everything. T'au all use the same weapons. Obviously, between Sept worlds, the designs are similar, but sub-designs, sub-versions, pistols, rifles, carbines, snipers, etc., are all going to be of different types. In addition, they have a lot of auxiliary forces, which, again, we won't be focusing on too heavily, the same thing that we won't be focusing on specific war suits all that heavily in this video. This is just going to be mostly infantry weapons, some heavy weapons, looking at the way that they work, their logistics, and their function. So, they're not all using the same weaponry. Obviously, battlesuits use larger versions or specialty versions of their pulse weapons, etc., but they're not all using the same exact thing because they have auxiliaries. Finally, T'au weapons are inherently better than X factions weapons. So this happens a lot where we go between factions and we say, well, oh, a plasma weapon is a standard infantry weapon. That means that they're so much better than X faction, or that means that they're so much better at doing this or that than other factions. We're going to tone that down just a little bit. It isn't a thing of wanting to decrease that idea of being inherently better. It's just getting into the idea of, infantry weapons for infantry weapon things, pure technology advancing instead of being more of a side grade. So I'm going to explain what I mean by this. Don't foam at the mouth just yet. I am working on this working concept that you'll understand as I get to weapons. But T'au weapons have a lot of advantages and some disadvantages in comparison to most other factions, as all factions do. But they are pretty darn good. So, let's get into the reality of the weapons. Again, that sub-advanced or side-grade technology. Essentially, the T'au have a basic concept. They have the idea of, well, we need an infantry rifle. And they go through what I call the checklist. The first one is, this weapon needs to support our combined arms tactics, which means that it needs to have essentially a scalable solution. So you might have a pistol version, a carbine version, a rifle version, and then a sniper version. Boom. That means that you can arm multiple different units with multiple different subtypes of the same weapon, and then you can effectively phase them out between your force so that you all have similar firepower, just in different packages. And then the second part of the side grade tech is they will then have, well, we have this basic idea for a standard infantry weapon, or for just a weapon in general, and then they will tie it into drone and technical assist. Now, technical assist is attaching it to a battlesuit. That's where they have an actual vehicle, in this case, a footed or a bipedal walker/jet powered vehicle, and that is providing the sensors, auspex, accuracy, all of the modifications needed to make this regular infantry weapon do much better than it technically should, or than it might be able to without those pieces. And then on the infantry side, when you don't have a battle suit that technical assist, you have drones and infantry technical assist, which is a thing as well. But drones effectively allow you to do a lot of different things with different weapons. Obviously, they allow you to identify targets that are far away. They can marker light things to identify targets for tracking and tracing using the automated heads-up display and HUD links that T'au have. And in addition to that, they can be put on drones as support weapons. And then finally, you have to scale down your expectations. This is a really big thing that I'd like to point out with the T'au. Even Fire Warriors, there is a mobility and weight consideration. Now, I went over the T'au before. Some of them are a little bit weaker than the average guardsman, but on par, the average guardsman, or the lower end of average guardsman, is going to be equal in strength to a fire warrior. So they're not wholly inferior to humans as a race, strength-wise, like some of the Eldar are. But their way of warfare is predominantly aggressive, meaning that the T'au are going to shy away from weapons that are not able to be moved by one individual very easily. So they have mobility and weight considerations. They're not going to be hauling around emplaced heavy support weapons like the Imperium of Man are, unless they can be attached to a platform like a battlesuit, or like a drone, or a grav drive, or a vehicle, something like that. Essentially, they won't have any of those super heavy saturation support weapons that the Imperial Guard have in the heavy bolter and the autocannon, because their way of warfare, that aggressive continued blitzkrieg, the Mont Ka, is reliant upon constant foot and or vehicle rolling aggression and rolling aggressing, aka moving into enemy territory, so there really is no time to set up heavy weapons or to be hauling around something that isn't easily man-portable. So you can see what I mean. They have a great thing at the start. They have a very technologically advanced weapon with a lot of specialty things inside of it, but then they have to modify it, essentially. They will take some deficiencies and they will improve them with drone and technical assist. They will take the basic concept and they will split it up into different sub-designs to fit their combined arm tactics, and then they will slim it down, decrease its weight, and just overall slim and streamline the design so that it can fit in with their mobility and weight considerations. Again, I'm not analyzing the art as much in this one, so I can make this video a little shorter. I already gave you guys 2+ hours for the adversaries video. So, pros and cons of T'au weapons. On the armor penetration side, this is a big pro. A lot of even the basic infantry weapons of the T'au have armor penetration on par with, if not better, than something like a Hellgun. So they are firing plasma for the most part, but the plasma that they fire is different from that of the plasma gun, which we'll talk about again. It's more of a slug or a thin stream of plasma rather than a ball or like a softball-sized group of energized particles, hydrogen. Now, the next thing Again, armor penetration is a pro. That's pretty universal. They don't have a lot of weapons that struggle too heavily with armor penetration, outside of explosives and some of their lower grade weapons like pistols and such, which we don't really address because pistols are not really all that important for most factions. Rate of fire. Most T'au weapons do seem to be semi-automatic, which is good. However, not a ton of them, at least on the infantry side of things, are full auto. So, while that is a con, while that lack of fully automatic saturation fire is a con, and they will rely more on that M14 kind of designated marksman or battle rifle style of shooting, where it's accuracy over rate of fire, not a lot of saturation fire, and wanting to hit every shot, rather than trying to rely on something that is just going to wing the enemy. They have another advantage that kind of evens this out to, I would say, a neutral or a light pro, and that is alternate fires. Now, this is really important with not only their drones, which have some of their own special things like marker lights, but also it has to do with the standard infantry weapons of the Fire Warrior Breachers. Now, the T'au Breachers, and a lot of the T'au in general, will have a lot of grenade launchers. Now, these are relatively short range, but they have a combination of either plasma and or more usually flashbang grenades, which they can launch out with their weapons like alternate fire. So I think that the fact that a lot of them don't have full auto is to a degree canceled out by the fact that many of them, especially the shorter range weapons, have a built-in grenade launcher to help them close that capability gap. Ammunition supply. I put this one as middling. Again, energy weapons have pros and cons. It is plasma, so it is going to be more massiest than just a battery. However, because it is plasma, it's not carrying around, or you're not carrying around a ton of like actual belted or cased ammunition. It's just kind of power packs similar to the las gun. However, on the other side of things, it is plasma. That means that it's going to be far more ammunition requires because it is shooting a gas, an ionized gas, in comparison to a laser, which is just pure energy. There's no transfer of energy in order to make the plasma like there is in the T'au weapon. So I'd put that one as neutral. I think there are times where it could definitely be a con, especially if you're in a long, drawn-out conflict where you're not able to get a lot of resupply. But since the entire T'au doctrine is built around not getting in that type of combat, I think that mitigates it quite a bit. Range. So this is a big thing. I've been saying it a couple of different ways in different videos and in different streams. And I would like to clear this up a little bit now. Range is a pro for the T'au, but it is a very complicated thing that I have to explain because the weapons themselves do not have great range. How does that make sense? Well, it's very simple. If I'm a human and I pick up a standard pulse rifle, the one that all these gentlemen have, and I tried to shoot a target that was able to be shot at by the T'au Fire Warrior with no assistance other than his own war gear, I would probably miss. Why is that? It is a plasma weapon, which means that there is ionized hydrogen, or ionized gas, plasma, energy, that is being contained by a magnetic or an otherwise ionized field that is being projected from my weapon at some speed, generally slower than a bullet, or slower than a rifle bullet, I should say. That means that it is going to suffer from two major negatives. One, at a certain point, that ionization field is going to weaken, meaning that the bolt, or in this case, since it's a pulse weapon, the slug of plasma will begin to diffuse, and it will begin to lose cohesion. Not only will that cause rotation or a mild rotational effect, again with the pulse rifles it's less pronounced than it is with plasma guns. Plasma guns form an actual rotating magnetic sphere that contains more explosive than the slug or the thin, bullet, basically, of plasma that the pulse weapons use. But still, that diffusion is the first big problem. The second one is that plasma weapons in 40k have a ballistic arc, at least a mild one. So, at some point, they will drop or they will wiggle out of their original intended design. Whether that is a result of the weapon's stabilization, essentially going off, that ionized magnetic field weakening and it beginning to fluctuate or vacillate, or whether it is the actual field that is weakening itself and that causes it to begin losing accuracy is unclear. However, what is clear is that if I were to take the weapon from the T'au and try and use it myself, I would probably be limited, in my opinion, to somewhere between 150 and 200 meters worth of perfect accurate range. Or not perfect, but at least reasonably accurate range. So firing outside of 200 meters, if I was a normal human just using the pulse rifle, I would begin to suffer severe accuracy problems. Now, a lot of people are going to yell at me. 500 meters is average for most infantry weapons. Lasgun can easily hit out to that range. The bolt weapons only begin to suffer significant accuracy problems at that range. Why are the pulse rifles different? Now, again, there's two more factors. This is a 3-factor range. The first one is the standard range. Obviously, that's the thing where I just take the rifle and I shoot it without any other assistance. I would say that, to be safe, it has around 200 meters of range. The rifle specifically, around 200 meters of range. That is almost twice as much as a standard plasma rifle. I say that because it carries a lot less payload. I would argue around a third to possibly half or a quarter, anywhere between there, just less payload than a standard plasma weapon for the Imperium. We see that in the fact that it doesn't really expand as much, it penetrates less armor generally, and it has way more accuracy and range, meaning that the field, the slug surrounding the plasma, is going to be thicker and more stable. So I give it 200 meters of range if I'm just using the weapon and no other systems. The second one is the targeting stabilizers. Now, these are two-part. One of them is the gyro stabilizer inside of the snout or muzzle, quote-unquote, of the weapon. The second part of it is actually in the helmet of the Fire Warrior. Now, you see this on almost all of them. The T'au have two eyes, spaced roughly evenly apart, and inside of their helmet is a heads-up display because they do not have bifocal vision out of their helmets. They have a pair of cameras, effectively, and that's what gives them that single split facial camera thing here. You can kind of see it here. There's like an aperture for two different lenses. What those lenses are, one is for vision, obviously, for the heads-up display. The second one, though, I think is locked to this muzzle reference sensor / stabilizer on front of almost all of their weapons. And what that does, it is a 2-factor system. One, it reads the weapon, essentially, and it determines its range. As a muzzle reference sensor, if you don't know, it essentially tells you where the exact muzzle of the weapon is aiming, and then it gives that information to the heads-up display and acts as a targeter. Which means that not only is the weapon able to gauge where its own accuracy is going to go. So imagine if you were throwing a ball and there was a string attached to the back end and you threw it up at an angle, that string is going to follow it. Essentially, that's what the stabilizer does. And in conjunction with the targeter, it allows the T'au to have much more of an idea where the weapon is going to begin failing and where its essentially where its wobble or where its instability is going to begin, and that will allow you to target it much more easily because you're effectively able to, without even doing anything so esoteric as aiming down sights, you're able to accurately determine where the decay in the projectile's arc, aka where it will begin to hit its aperture at around 200 meters, it loses that pinpoint accuracy, it begins to break down, it begins to lose its stability, and you are able to pinpoint exactly where that's going to go. Now, it remains consistently powered even if it loses its stability. And obviously, like a ballistic weapon, this is going to be affected by things like humidity, wind, all that stuff, because it is still energy moving through air. And the last thing of that 3-factor range, I would say, is the marker light or drone assist. So, the first thing is going to get you, again, just picking up as a standard weapon and firing it, around 200 meters of range. The targeter and stabilizers, I would argue, could even double that, because at the 200 meters, it's still pinpoint straight accuracy from muzzle to target. That means that past that point, it's going to begin to decay in its arc. It's either going to change directions mildly, wing around like a curveball, or it's going to begin to drop. What the stabilizer and targeter allows you to do is determine, using the weapon as a reference, where that decay is going to actually put the slug, so to speak, and then you could kind of adjust and account for that, and almost like an artillery piece, you can aim at a slight angle, or you can begin to slightly shift your point of aim until you essentially lock onto the target to where the bolt is going to decay and hit in close to that area. It's no longer going to be pinpoint accurate, yes, but it is going to have a much higher chance of hitting than basically just guessing without the targeter and stabilizer. So I think that targeter and stabilizer stage can give you up to twice the amount of range. So after the 200 meters, that is like that rifle straight accuracy, 400 meters is probably the limit that an individual warrior with his targeter and his stabilizer is going to be able to accurately hit a target with the standard infantry weapon. Now that is pretty good. That is pretty impressive. With a lasgun, that's where it starts to lose the first bit of its killing power. With a bolter, that's where it's going to start realizing a little bit more of its weakness in velocity and range. Again, it's going to be coming back down from its speed arc, but 400 meters, that's probably where a standard T'au warrior would be comfortable hitting a man-sized target with a pulse rifle and his armor systems. The last part of the three-factor range factor is marker lights and drone assistance. Now, this essentially means when a T'au is using his targeter and stabilizer, he can have a drone giving him essentially a 3D recreation of where his shot's going to go. And I think that this can increase his range up to another 200 meters, because what this allows him to do is aim up at a severe angle, almost like a mortar shell, or like a very, very long sniper shot. So if you know, due to bullet drop, you are going to have, with a sniper rifle, a significant drop, up to like 5 or 6 meters at this type of distance, around 600 meters range. You're going to have to start adjusting for that range difference, and especially with heavier weapons, again, I'm not saying plasma is heavy, it's just the fact that this is a slug traveling with much more ballistic accuracy than a standard plasma weapon, so it's not twisting and spinning and going in a relative arc. It's going to be much more like you're throwing a long dart out at an enemy. So it's less stable than that, but it is more accurate, and its decay arc is easier to calculate, meaning that with a marker light, giving you extra coordinates essentially on how to triangulate a target, or with drone assistance, you can essentially tilt the rifle up, continue to have the stabilizer tell you the decay arc, use your targeter to identify the correct angle at which you need to fire, and then essentially at a 10 to maybe 15 or even higher degree angle, you need to fire, and then it will essentially arc over and hit a target, which again I could argue would probably reach the absolute maximum range of the weapon at around 600 meters. That is very generous. That is longer than most standard infantry weapons will retain this level of lethality, because it is a plasma slug. So that's my reasoning. I will apply the three-factor range things to most stuff, so if drones aren't available, that third factor isn't going to be there. If you're using the weapons without the targeters and stabilizers, again, not going to be there, so it's just going to drop the range by a factor of 3. Sorry, that was a long one, but considering what I've said so far, I had to get that out so that people were aware of what the hell I'm talking about when I go into the next bit. Damage effect. Pretty good. Honestly, I'd put this as a major pro. Most of the weapons in the T'au arsenal are using very high temperature energy weapons. While that doesn't work against a lot of stuff, especially stuff armored with ceramite, which has very high thermal resistance, as we've seen, it does have a lot more thermal effect than something like a lasgun, and it could do really, really good damage against a lot of targets, even ones that have some kinetic or thermal armor in front of them because of this. However, it is not fair to compare the pulse rifle with the Imperial plasma weapon. The difference, again, like I said, is probably by a factor of 3 in terms of outright damage if you compare a plasma rifle's shot to a pulse weapon's shot. So, armor penetration, the actual damage effect is good, but the actual damage in terms of like scale is going to be a little bit inferior to a standard plasma weapon. Again, differs based on the weapons, but pulse weapons seem to be the most common, so we're going to talk about those. Effect on different targets. Again, there isn't really anything that these super struggle against, so I'd put that as another pro. Fire warriors using the weapon. Again, I think that they are the first chain in this three-factor range, meaning that they are going to be massively important for the weapons reaching their target, essentially, or making sure that they are getting effective shots on target. Numbers advantages and disadvantage. Drones versus battlesuits. So, The T'au will have very variable numbers. The SEP worlds put out all different types of units and formations of many different types and of many different numbers. However, generally they are going to be outnumbered by any Imperial military force, aka regiments. But PDF, they might be on par, or they might be on par manpower for manpower. But the big thing is drones and battlesuits, or drones versus battlesuits. Drones can make up for a lot of bad numbers. Essentially, since it can give that extra factor of either being a sentry gun or providing extra accuracy for the troops, they can make a standard infantry squad far more deadly than they would be on paper. Battlesuits, on the other hand, they do essentially a combination between what the standard grunt can do and what a grunt can do with a drone. So it combines the systems or the assisting material or the assisting technology of the drone with the warrior inside, giving him access to all those bonuses by himself. And then finally, the Montka. This is that continuous, aggressive, blitzkrieg behavior that the T'au engage in. So without better ado, let's move right on. So, how it works and the logic session. Again, this is Xenos weaponry. How it works, the logic of it, to a point, it helps, but I can only explain to you so much. Mitigation, really the best thing to do with the T'au is outnumber and outrange them, but I've done an adversaries video, so go ahead and take a look at that if you'd like to learn from there. So, let's talk about pulse weapons, because I've already talked about them like 30 times, right? So, these are plasma slug guns. They are semi-AP, again, they have less material fired out of them than a standard plasma gun, so they don't have that same insane level of penetration. So I put them as semi-AP, similar in penetration to a Hell gun, because while they are much more excited, they are also not emptying all of their energy perfectly into the target like the Hell gun is in a single blast. It is much more that slug that hits, and then essentially the outer area will disintegrate, and then it will spray like a plasma gun omnidirectionally both into and away from the armor. And when I deal with plasma gun penetration, I usually judge it to be a little bit more than half of the width, quote-unquote, of the bolt in terms of a ball. So if you squeezed the slug together, or you squeezed it into a rectangle and then chopped it in half, that's roughly how much armor it would penetrate. Roughly. It may be different for different weapons, but again, I put it as semi-AP, similar to a Hell gun in penetration. So, it comes in various different variants. Obviously, there's a pistol variant. I don't talk about the pistols because pistols are not all that important. The first one, the carbine, the pulse carbine, this is the one with the added-in little flashbang launcher. Very cool. These are more for short-range assault units. They have a range of roughly 70 meters at minimum. Again, apply the 3-factor. Even if we don't have drones, that gives us accuracy out to 140 meters. Given drones on top of that, that gives us access to a little bit above 200 meters of range. So still very good with drone assistance, but even without drone assistance, it's an acceptable infantry weapon if it is a lot more short range than something like a lasgun. And then for the rifle, what this gentleman is toting right here, again, 200, 400 for the standard T'au infantryman. And then if you were to add drones into the equation, we could get up to 600, but at that range, we're talking about a lot more complexity and possibly a little less hitting power. And then finally, for the sniper variants. Now, sniper variants could be anywhere between 300, 350, 375, whatever you want to say it is, but I'm going to say it's 300. And that would give it 300, 600 on average. So it's the T'au long-range sniper rifle would probably have perfect accuracy out to 600 meters. And then, given drone assistance, given that mild adjustment with the asset assist, they're going to be out to 900 plus meters, which is on par with the average shot for a long las, which makes sense for the weapon's accuracy in the lore. These are firing a slug, which essentially is, again, that twisted skein of energy that is surrounding or cupping a small core of essentially energized particles, plasma. You can see it here, that kind of it's almost like a two-piece in a lot of pulse weapons, but I would see it almost as if they're intertwining, or it's like a figure-8 bubble of energy holding them together and performing a lengthy slug rather than the magneticized ball that is used in plasma weapons. If you want to look into my plasma weapon video, I made another one on it. Ionized weapons. So you have one down here, it's the ion rifle. These come from Xenos weaponry, and they're not as common as I thought they were, but they are an ionized air laser or a heavy laser. Essentially, instead of using photons, instead of using light, they use ionized material. It's either a crystal or air, or a mixed crystal and air, which essentially just means it's a little bit heavier, and it means that the actual impact and penetration is slightly higher. Again, I would put it as a little bit stronger than a Hellgun. You could say that it's just below a multi-laser, and I think I would buy that, but it doesn't seem to have as good penetration. It might be variable, but at least the infantry weapon doesn't have a ton of penetration as far as I saw. Though I could be wrong about that. It could be on par with the multi-laser. I think it's just a little bit weaker. But it probably has a pretty similar range. Again, it's a laser, so it's going to lack any of that annoying ballistic stuff that the pulse weapon has. The heavy plasma weapons. Now, these are ones that I don't necessarily have on this slide, because these are all, like, fusion weapons. But heavy plasma weapons are on a lot of the T'au vehicles. These are heavy armor-piercing weapons. They're similar to a plasma cannon, you just increase the size. The other thing with these heavy plasma weapons for the T'au is that there are examples of them that are similar to pulse weapons, or at least they seem to be bulked up pulse weapon in size. Now you can see this with like the pulse blaster, and generally I believe that those will work more like the pulse weapons, aka it's going to be firing a slug instead of the magnetized ball that the heavy plasma weapons will have. The thing that differentiates them, again, is just going to be the volume of plasma in each shot, and the heavy plasma weapons will have better armor penetration because it's not a thin kind of slug of plasma, it is a ball of ionized plasma, or a ball of ionized hydrogen plasma. Diffuse plasma weapons. So this is plasma, this is fusion weapons and other like armor-piercing plasma weapons. You can see them here. These are cool, and I actually looked a little bit into the lore and logic of these because I was kind of interested in how they worked. I have begun referring to them as the plasma super soaker or the fat melta weapon. Now, it says they're melta weapons. I actually think that the T'au have done something really smart here, and they have made melta weapons fat. Now, what do I mean by fat? I mean that they have essentially taken away, or not necessarily taken away like decreased, but they have taken away all of the reliance that Melta has on liquid metal inside of the plasma, and they've just dispensed with that by adding metal to incredibly high temperature plasma. So they've essentially created very, very high energy plasma, even higher than the standard like plasma weapons or the pulse weapons, and then they have doped that with metal to increase its armor penetration effect. These are lethally AP, and they work like a super soaker. So they will either be very directed, similar to a pulse rifle, and it will just be like a stream instead of a slug, and it will still be doped with that metal to make that melta effect. You know, why I call it the fat melta. It's less actual material, but it's actually way more energetic. So that's why blue instead of red. That's why kind of a blast of it rather than a spray or a beam. And the result of this is that it can have some seriously nasty effects. Not only do the T'au sometimes make swords out of these, but even the standard one, this kind of arm-held or handheld one that the Crisis suits have, these ones can penetrate a ton of armor, and they have pretty on par range with the Melta weapons. Some of them are a little bit longer, but that seems to only be on very large vehicles or on very big battle suits, which is on par for Melta weapons as well. So it's like that plasma super soaker kind of keeps a reservoir of very, very high energy plasma, and then sprays it through with a little bit of metal to give it a tiny bit of extra punch, and then unleashes it in a double burst or stream, like a super soaker. Then, next one up is rail weapons. Again, there are two types of rail weapons of the T'au. There's the ones that the infantry use and the ones that the vehicles use. Obviously, the vehicle ones are going to be much larger, much more powerful. The infantry weapons probably just make up for the fact that they are... probably just make up for the fact that a lot of their weapons don't work against heavy armor. But the T'au rail rifles do seem to be designate armor-piercing, in addition to being snipers' weapons. So they are accurate weapons. They're very accurate up to a considerable range because they don't rely on plasma fields like the pulse weapons do. So none of that bullshit. We're back to classic old kinetics. However, unlike the rail rifles, which seem to have a solid shell, the bigger ones on the T'au vehicles and on the T'au battlesuits seem to have a magnetic shell. instead of a solid shell, which is just a solid piece of steel, titanium carbide, or tungsten carbide, whatever you need to make it out of in your mind, adamantium, whatever it is. Instead of a solid penetrator of that, it seems to be a shell coated in very heavy, dense magnetic material that also has high explosive within it. Now, again, I've seen multiple different interpretations. There could be a high explosive version of this, or an armor-piercing high explosive, and then like a standard, just Sabo-style rail weapon round. But the bigger ones tend to seem to have more variety. And they work like a standard rail weapon. The rail guns for the T'au, the handheld ones, they have a very limited like fire speed and also probably a significant amount of lead up and limits to what they can do in terms of after armor penetration. So they basically sacrifice almost all of their utility in exchange for armor penetration and range, which is not bad. It's still a really nice anti-armor weapon. But the really big ones, they're going to be more effective against bigger armor. The other thing is that I don't consider rail weapons to be applicable as artillery options. Some people say that the T'au rail rifles, especially, or the T'au rail rifles and more especially the bigger ones on the suits and on the tanks can be used as indirect fire. Now, this would make sense with the magnetic shells. However, the range of a rail rifle, or the damage of the rail rifle, is very heavily reliant upon velocity, and since there is no secondary acceleration, and the secondary explosive effect of a magnetic shell is going to be relatively small in comparison to something like an artillery shell, it is not going to be very effective as an indirect fire artillery weapon. It's going to be much more effective as a direct fire weapon, which means that you're not going to be doing something like tilting the tank back or tilting the suit back and firing up at a high angle, because as they come down, yes, it will have more velocity, but it's also going to suffer from instability, probably, and also from not having as much hitting power as it would otherwise. So it's an option. I just don't think that it's a reliable one. And given the limitations in power, weight, size, and the waste of ammunition, it is nowhere close to standard artillery in terms of utility. Missiles. So they come in two variants. There are smart missiles and there are dumb missiles. The smart missiles obviously track. The dumb missiles don't. They're more like rockets. So, again, I've gone over these here. Yep, I have. And this is just a really, really big one. They also seem to have some armor-piercing, like hunter-killer missiles, but those would be more of the smart variety. While some of them can track targets, they don't seem to be able to change all that easily in flight, and they will have better effectiveness, again, at firing directly at a target, where they're not going to have to maneuver over or around anything, mostly because they don't seem to be able to, unless that object is moving behind something. So if you got locked onto and then you moved behind a wall, the missiles would probably follow you and hit the wall. They wouldn't shift over it or twist around it all that easily, unless they were going right by it at the time and they were moving around. So you want to lock onto a target that's in the open, doesn't really have any cover, with the smart missiles, but, you know, fire one after another, you could probably do the job. Not to mention, dumb rockets will always work like dumb rockets do. So, patterns and types. Some of these are also on infantry ones, the missile pods. This is just going to be a moment to go over a couple of things. So, the bigger versions of especially pulse weapons, they just get into the same thing with Knights and Titans, that just at a certain point it's so big that I'm not really able to analyze it using real-world infantry tactics stuff, because it's no longer in that realm. I'm not going to say, well, it's going to do this to a person and have this much range. I couldn't tell you. It's entirely technological. There's nothing ballistic about this thing. So it's difficult to identify. However, you can notice a consistent thing with most T'au weapons. They are relatively light, relatively technological, and most of them are honestly pretty thin and spindly in a lot of cases, especially with the ion rifle, the rail rifle, and the pulse rifle. This is almost like a 2x4 that you have given a handle. But that is very specific to that whole T'au cut down their original ideas to fit their requirements deal. The only ones that I didn't talk about are the fancy ones that the Kroot use. So the Kroot rifle, it's almost like a single-shot kind of break-action rifle, but it's got melee weapons on it. There are several different missile types and sub-missile types in the missile pods. Some of them are infantry, most of them are just used on vehicles, and here's that burst cannon that I was talking about. The difference, again, between the pulse blaster and the standard pulse rifle, and the size comparison between the rail rifle and the ion rifle. Again, the rifles are really long. At least the rail rifle is, while the others are kind of going to be shoulder mounted. But you can see here again, there's no real like bipod support weapons, and even the rail rifle that might have a bipod for stability. By the way, the bipod is another example why they probably wouldn't have it aim up and out of the way, because why would you add a bipod if you're going to fire it like that? Might help in some cases, but in most cases that's actually just going to get in your way. But yeah, very interesting. You can see the kind of consistent design here. Users, importance, and logistics. Again, these are infantry of the SEP. Their auxiliaries, like the Kroot and other folks, they use their own weapons. We talked in the adversaries video about the Vespid weapons. They kind of take the idea of ion weapons and they fill them with like blamite or blastite or whatever it is. Somebody corrected me in the video and I got it wrong again. But blamite, and they are explosive lasers. Didn't really make a lot of sense what the weapons were, but it's explosive lasers. But you can see here again, the T'au tanks, aircraft, all their battle suits are essentially using big, nasty, much more aggressive, much larger, more firepower intensive versions of their standard pulse, rail, or ion weapons, with the exception of the auxiliaries, like the Kroot, which are essentially using buffalo bore anti-elephant rifles. But yeah, it's very consistent, and you can see that quite often they will go to bear with a ton of drones for that extra like 30 to 20% of range. So, I hope that was concise enough for you guys. I hope that my explanations were acceptable. I think I've reached an acceptable compromise on the range thing, because stick to certain things in certain ranges and certain things in other ranges, and there are deficiencies at every size, but this is just a way for me to even out. And couple of melee memes I think I've earned for my glorious compromising, and with a double upload tonight, I will wish you all a lovely good night.